different from all other wars of the past.
For Tom Chikansky, the museum is personal. His dad, Alphonse, served in the Second World War, and now his uniform hangs on display.
He had a Thompson submachine gun, and he used to fire it from the hip.
He says they didn't realize until years later the significance of what his father had been through in Normandy and Pearl Harbor.
He was sitting in the mess hall. He'd gotten up early. He was a corporal, and there was a table for non-commissioned officers, and they were drinking their coffee when Japanese planes flew over and strafed the barracks. And I remember him saying there were several men in his company who were killed while they were still asleep.
Tom's aunts and uncles also served in the war, which inspired him to enlist in the reserves and was on active duty in the 80s. The museum highlights an American experience during World War II, from the battles soldiers fought to how families handled changes back home.
I think the largest story that runs throughout is that the people in World War II were average individuals like you and I are today. And we tell the story not as much as the generals and the grand strategies, but of the individual.
Tom says the goal of the museum is to show the facts of history and allow younger folks to reflect on the tragedy of war and how the country rallied together in challenging times.
It's critical for Americans to remember that at one point in our history, we did all come together, we set politics aside, and we all came together for the greater good of the country and the world.
As the state recovers from the pandemic, more school tours are coming through the doors. The museum also provides online resources for teachers to better help them teach about the war.
This war is a new kind of war.
What started as a small collection to recognize New Orleans native Andrew Jackson Higgins for his efforts in the war creating the Higgins boats is now a federally recognized institution.
When we first opened, we used to see a lot more veterans. And the veterans would often come with their families and their children and grandchildren and tour the museum, and they would learn about what their grandparents did during the war. And as time has gone on, there are less and less veterans who are able to travel.
The museum has been growing for decades. Now a new exhibit based around the Holocaust and liberation of concentration camps is under construction. Every day for 20 years, Tom has walked through the doors of the museum and passed by his father's uniform. To him, keeping the mission of the museum alive is an honor to celebrate those he has met along the way.
The hardest part of this job is that those people are all passing away, but it's an honor for me to be able to work here and to make sure their story is told.